had this thesis that kind of the business, the future, the digital. In order to remain relevant as an online business or as someone who does business online, you need to have like a digital media infrastructure built within your company. And so HubSpot purchased TheHustle. I stuck around there for a little bit, but then found this opportunity to consult with other newsletters and other publications, helping them grow their lists, helping them grow their subscriber base, monetize. Why don't we start building newsletters for companies that have email lists or want to grow email lists? And create their own newsletter. And so that's what we do with Tailwind.
Hey everyone, welcome to Behind the Frames. Today I sat down with Ryan Carr. Ryan is the founder of the Tailwind Studio, an agency that helps brands build, scale, and monetize their newsletters.
People think of the newsletter as the bottom of the funnel. It's like, great, they're on my list. That's it. Like, that's another subscriber. I'll be able to monetize any day now. It's like, no, you should really have a route to monetization on day one. And the newsletter acts as the top middle of funnel to driving to that monetization action. It becomes a question of attributable value, attributable revenue pretty quickly. And that's what businesses are built on. I don't think it's a bubble. I think it is a hype cycle. What's happening is that.
And in my conversation with Ryan, we talked about his expertise and his lesson learned from building TheHustle, which then sold to the Hubspot for over $27 million. We talked about his exploration to finding his ideal customer profiles, ICP. And last but not least, we talked about the state of the newsletter industry. Are we in a bubble? Are we in a hype cycle? And should newsletters raise venture capital money? And welcome to my conversation with Ryan. So to start us off, could you tell us a little bit about what you do, a newsletter operator, and the Tailwind?
Yeah, absolutely. So prior to starting Tailwind, I was at TheHustle, which is a business tech newsletter. We were acquired by Hubspot. I was leading growth there for both the daily newsletter and for Trends, which is the premium subscription side of TheHustle. So was doing that up through the Hubspot acquisition. Hubspot acquired TheHustle because they, like a lot of businesses, had this thesis that kind of the business, the future, the digital. In order to remain relevant as an online business or as someone who does business online, you need to have like a digital media infrastructure built within your company. And so HubSpot purchased TheHustle. I stuck around there for a little bit, but then found this opportunity to consult with other newsletters and other publications, helping them grow their lists, helping them grow their subscriber base, monetize more effectively, basically just apply the Hustle playbook to their own publications and newsletters. And in doing that, we kind of discovered this opportunity and said, well, now that we know we've worked across all these different verticals, we've seen what works really well and what makes a great newsletter great, why don't we start building newsletters for companies that have email lists or want to grow email lists and create their own newsletter. And so that's what we do with Tailwind. We are a done-for-you newsletter as a service agency, and we build weekly newsletters for companies that want to build an audience and an asset.
Awesome. So what does done for you mean as an agency?
Yeah, so done for you in the context of Tailwind is essentially end to end. We handle the actual build out of the newsletter, the design, we create the template, the landing page, basically make sure that the entire newsletter is set up and ready to launch. And then we launch it. And then from there, our team actually handles the weekly writing, design, scheduling, delivery, and reporting on the newsletter. So if you're say an e-com business and you have this email list, and maybe you send out a few email marketing blasts every now and then, but you don't really engage the list beyond that, what Tailwind does is we step in and say, we'll take this list and we'll build a newsletter that's super valuable to the people on your email list, gets them to open, gets them to engage, builds a relationship with your brand, and ultimately drives to more revenue.
So from your website, I saw this quote, every new email subscriber is more win in your sale, and you are the master of your own fate. So how do you interpret it?
Yeah, so the difference between a newsletter, building an email list, and building an audience on a social platform like X or Meta is that an email list is an owned audience versus a rented audience. So you're building an X audience. At any given point, X could remove your profile or they can alter their algorithm so that you get less reach and you suddenly have less access to the same audience that you had access to. Whereas building an email list, every time you add an email subscriber, that's a new member of your owned audience. You just have a lot more control over how you communicate with that audience, when you communicate with them. Your reach never decreases unless deliverability stuff happens, and that's kind of a nuanced topic in itself. But at the same time, it's just an owned audience versus a rented audience, and that's kind of the dichotomy that a lot of businesses are learning to navigate better.
Cool. And you talked a little bit about building audience on X that
isn't transferable over, and you don't really have the control on how the messages are communicated. How do you manage your distribution? And last week TikTok were just banned by the White House. And think about all these creators on TikToks who have thousands or hundreds of thousands of followers that is gonna be vanished in 6 months. How do they gonna retain those audiences? It's really through one is diversification, and two is just by owning the audience. And newsletters and emails are sort of the ways to do so. So I'm curious, when you think about building newsletters or building The Hustle a few years back, that concept isn't really popular back then. So I'm curious, back then, do you think the proposition of The Hustle was different? How do you think about The Hustle back then versus now?
Yeah, so The Hustle started because Sam Carr wanted to meet cool people in San Francisco. And so he threw this conference called HustleCon and had a good turnout, and it was profitable. But in addition to making the money from the conference, he also had a bunch of contact information from people who had signed up for the conference. And so he had all these emails. And so he took kind of a permissionless approach to it, in a good way, and said, well, I have all these emails that these people gave me for communications about HustleCon. What if we just started sending out an email to this list of HustleCon attendees? And I could just send them the news every day, or send them kind of my takes on interesting stories and stuff that I'm finding. And so the mission of The Hustle pretty early on was just create a cool platform for sending people interesting news, and hopefully they refer friends, and it grows. And it grew really organically, especially at the start. Just through referral program and through people sharing it with their friends. And so the mission of The Hustle pretty early on was just sharing cool, valuable content. I don't think, and even in what we do in like Tailwind, like building newsletters for businesses with, a business outcome in mind at the end of the funnel, successful newsletters are still going to follow that same model, where it's first and foremost about like providing value to the people reading it. People are too smart for you to just get away with being, I'll just create a newsletter and put a bunch of just random links that maybe they'll think are interesting or not. Even if it's like a curated newsletter where you're just curating links, and some newsletters are built that way, you still need to put a lot of thought into the curation. The focus should just be on providing value first and foremost. So while newsletters as a medium have gotten more popular, and a lot of people have business outcomes in mind when they think of building a newsletter now, I still think that the way you'll be successful is just by creating good content that's valuable to people.
Let's say when you were building The Hustle, that started with Sam Parr just wanting to share cool news and cool stories and insights with the people who attended to the Hustle Con, and to 2 years later, it has become one of the most popular business magazines for people all over North America and the rest of the world to read about. Then you move to HubSpot to lead sort of the growth initiatives, to help reach more people, to help lead the distribution effort. Could you tell us a little bit about sort of the role that you play back at The Hustle versus HubSpot?
It didn't change too much. So essentially, I was leading growth first for the daily newsletter, and then incorporating trends more into that as well. And then towards the end, a lot of my focus was just on growing trends, which is the premium subscription, especially by the time we had joined HubSpot. And so it didn't really change all too much. I think a good move that HubSpot made, and kind of an intentional decision, was they realized that like what made The Hustle great was the culture and the people. And so they really tried to keep that intact. So, even though we were rolled up into HubSpot, it still felt like The Hustle, at least at the time that I was there. And so, yeah, not too much changed. I was just really tasked with growing the subscriber list, and then ultimately growing the list of trends members. So managing channels like Facebook ads, Twitter ads, TikTok ads, YouTube, influencer, affiliates, kind of all that stuff, and leveraging those channels as best and as efficiently as possible to just increasing revenue for trends.
I see. So when you were first starting out building Tailwind, how was like the first 90 days been?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So there was kind of this less formal group or amalgamation of consulting opportunities prior to Tailwind. And then building Tailwind was a much more intentional decision of, okay, now we're going to do this as our main service, which is actually creating the newsletters. Yeah, first 90 days, there was we had identified there was an opportunity for this just from experience in the industry and talking to a lot of people who wanted to do this kind of thing, and speaking with a lot of like friends and colleagues of mine in and running that idea by them. And so we did get like good momentum up front where a lot of opportunities and kind of warm leads coming in. And so we were able to grow pretty quickly. And yeah, we've just learned so much we've only been doing Tailwind since August, really. That's when we started doing like the Tailwind service, kind of the partnership model. And we have learned just an incredible amount about what works, what doesn't work, what kinds of businesses a newsletter works really well for. And so yeah, it's been wild, but it's been a very accelerated learning process.
I see. I want to double click on sort of the accelerated learning process. I think with a lot of service agency or even content itself, it's very, very important to get sort of the framing of ICP, your ideal customer profile, who are your audience, who are you selling to. If I think about newsletters themselves, there are a ton of different types of creators. People who already have an established audience looking to do more like a newsletter offline platform. Some people who wanted to start with a newsletter, then rolled up onto like podcast media platforms or somewhere in between. How, maybe two questions: what is your ICP and how did you find that at the beginning?
Yeah, another good question. It's so we've now operated Tailwind for a pretty wide variety of verticals, niches, and types of businesses. And the biggest takeaway, and this is really kind of going into kind of the state of newsletters as a whole, really too, but monetization, especially operating as an agency and a done-for-you agency with a somewhat premium price point, you need to prove out revenue. You need to be able to take a newsletter, what we're creating, and say, okay, this is how it's generating revenue for you in your business, and this is how it's backing out, and this is how we're generating an ROI, right? And for some businesses, a newsletter is not going to do that as effectively as just traditional email marketing. Just sending a direct response blast for if you're like an e-com business, and there are some e-com businesses where I think a newsletter could work, but it doesn't make sense for every business to have a newsletter. And also even if it makes sense to have a newsletter, you need to go about creating the newsletter the right way for it to work as a revenue generator. And so in terms of an ICP, what we've started to realize more and more is in order for the offer to work effectively, a business needs to have a pretty high average LTV. And in terms of like categories of products, or businesses, I should say too, information products work well, courses work well, and service agencies work well. So agencies, Tailwind, like having a newsletter that builds expertise or demonstrates expertise, builds rapport, just gives value up front for free. If you're an agency, if you're a service agency, say you create Facebook ads, for example, and you create Facebook ads for businesses, if you have a newsletter that's every week will share some examples of top performing Facebook ads, why they work, why they perform well, learnings that we've had, benchmarks, etc., and you're providing that to marketers, that's a lot of value that they're going to get out of that. They're going to open that because it helps them do their job better. And then eventually when the time comes and the decision maker who's been reading this newsletter for a while says, oh, we need to hire a Facebook ads agency, you'll be the agency that they go to. It's also super helpful for agencies in that situation to build front-end digital products. So like so I'm a Facebook ads expert. I have a done for you Facebook service. I'm going to feature that as one call out in my newsletter, but maybe I have a course that's like, you know what I mean? Or a video course that's $100 for an ebook or something like that. That's just another way to generate revenue through the newsletter as well, and kind of a way to qualify people for an offer. Getting a little bit in the weeds, but overall, to answer your question, high LTV service offerings, information products, courses, generally, I would say we've identified as being a really good area for us.
You can also think of it as like a funnel, like a creator stack. So if you're like an entrepreneur or like a creator, it's very likely that you're not on a single platform. You're on like a multitude of platforms, from Instagram, TikTok, to short form videos to maybe long form videos like YouTube. Then you might have Discord for like your community, podcasts on Spotify, and you would have maybe like a newsletter outlet to own your audience, to have these like weekly or like even multiple times a week communications and touch points. And you're saying a lot of your audience are like business owners who offer knowledge services, offer digital products, are selling to customers with like high lifetime value, so LTV. And with that being said, like you mentioned an example of being like e-com. I think that was pretty interesting, that it doesn't make sense for like e-commerce business to have a newsletter, because you mentioned LTV might not as high as the other ones. A lot of times it's more one-time interaction that I buy this water bottle and I'm probably not going to buy it again for a long time. So I'm curious if you have maybe other examples to share a little bit about like, oh, I thought it would work, but I guess it doesn't.
Yeah, I think it can work for ecom, but I also just think that like if I was in a position of advising somebody in an e-commerce business, I would say make sure that you're really like juicing the list in terms of just direct response emails too. You know what I mean? Because those are always going to be higher revenue per send for a business because it's less of a considered purchase, like a water bottle, for example, right? It's like if you can send a discount blast or you have automations in place that send marketing emails once a week, that might be a better investment of effort just because, a newsletter about water bottles with one call out to buy the water bottle. I'm just giving an example, but like a newsletter that has one call out at the end is going to have less conversions than an email that's sent that's like all about buying this water bottle, right? So for businesses like that, it might just make sense to just have a more traditional approach to email marketing. That being said, it can be like a helpful ancillary channel for those, especially for businesses that have money to invest in brand awareness, right? I think then it becomes, if you have a brand awareness budget or a brand marketing budget, I do think that like a newsletter is a good move, more so than like maybe like a billboard, because it's more attributable. You can put links in it. You can buy an audience on Facebook or Twitter or TikTok or whatever paid marketing channel you want and own that audience over time. So it's a good investment in that regard. In terms of direct ROI for an e-com business, it might not work as well as it would for other businesses.
Makes sense. And when you were building Tailwind, I'm curious, how do you go about qualifying what customers you want to work for? Especially, I'm asking this because I think there are a lot of people who might want your advice or want your services, but maybe not all of them are operating in areas that you're familiar with, or maybe not all of them that you have the confidence to really manage it and monetize it, help them comfort. How do you go about sort of qualifying your leads?
Yeah. So we have like different tier engagements for folks that have, well, I'll say that our process, we have a research team and a writing team, both super talented. At the beginning of every engagement, we'll collect information about what are the sources that our research team should be scouring on a weekly basis to collect and aggregate the information that will go into the newsletter, Twitter accounts to follow, YouTube channels to follow, podcasts to listen to, news outlets to subscribe to, all this stuff. They collate all of that. And then our writing team will synthesize that into the newsletter, pick out themes, pick out big stories, write briefs on them. So when it comes to researching or at least like having like an extensive background knowledge, we find that like we can pick that up pretty quickly, or at least do a good job of providing valuable information through a tight feedback loop with the partner and just through our research team's experience and the operations that we built there. If there are, however, topics and niches that really the valuable information would come from the partner themselves and it would be harder to find elsewhere. So say there's a newsletter called the Van Trump Report, and it's this guy who, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but it's this guy who he makes a ton of money off of this newsletter, but it's a newsletter for farmers. And it's like all of this agricultural information that he has access to just because of his network and the sources that they've built in there. So if someone like that came to us and said, hey, can you build like a fantastic agricultural newsletter that requires all of this industry knowledge and information, I'd probably say we probably can't do it, just because I don't feel confident that we can provide the level of value that would be needed to justify this existing. That being said, we do work with those partners in that regard on kind of a different tiered engagement where we'll handle all of the operations, bring our knowledge about best practices for growth, for monetization, even as far as just they create the content or provide the information for the content and then our team writes. So there's different approaches in those cases, but I would say generally qualification is just, do you have an email list that you want to start sending this to? Or if you don't, do you have the means to grow it? So we've started with some partners from zero subscribers and grown it to 50 subscribers. It's just about them having the budget and the motivation to actually grow the list with us creating the content. Otherwise, we're sending to no one, or we're sending to too small of an audience for it to make sense.
I think it's very interesting when you highlighted that there were sort of two teams, one focused on research and one focused on writing. Because sometimes when I think about these agencies, they would have teams dedicated to different accounts. So for example, I have like 5 clients, and I could be having 2 teams. One would be managing client A and B, and the other team would be managing client C, D, and E. But when you talk about your approach, it was more, I have 5 clients for all these 5 kind of newsletters management. I would have the writing team focus on the writing for all of them, and a research team focusing on all of them. Is that in line with what you were thinking?
It's actually kind of similar to your approach in that of the research team and writing teams, they work really hand in hand, and there's a lot of collaboration there. And the writing team provides direct feedback to the research team, and the research team collects feedback from, and we have account managers as well. But I would say what we do is upon onboarding a new client, I will assign a couple of writers and a couple of researchers. So there are writers and researchers that have specific accounts, but just like in terms of their functions and the general operations of their roles, I do think of them as just separate roles just because one fulfills one duty, which is getting all the research together, the other synthesizes it all and creates a great newsletter. So yeah, it's a little bit of both.
A lot of people have shared questions is about how often should they be sending newsletters. So I think there probably isn't an answer, a tangible answer to that. But I'm thinking how you think about what are the questions they need to ask themselves to determine like what is the right amount of frequency should they send in newsletters? Because sometimes people may think about there's like a diminishing return when you send between 2 times a week and 3 times a week. It takes up 50% more effort to do so, but the value that you might be delivering would not be as much as the incremental effort. But at the same time, like creators might struggle to think about, oh, am I being annoying? Am I like bothering our audience? Is there like a healthy number that I could maintain to send newsletter to my audience over a long period of time? So curious to see your take.
Yeah, I think there is no right answer to how many times a week. I think your take on it is my take, which is you should send as often as you can commit to maintaining while still maintaining the level of quality or value that you're providing in the newsletter. So it's more important that every time the person opens the newsletter, they get something out of it and it's actionable and valuable than you sending it 3 times a week. That's what I would say. And for a lot of people, it's just easier to start with weekly. And I would definitely, if you're starting from scratch and like you're just about to start a newsletter, I would say start with weekly. Don't commit to like doing it 2 or 3 times a week because then it becomes a chore and overwhelming. And it's better to just build the habit of doing it consistently than overcommitting yourself and running out of things to write about and feeling you're sending something out that isn't representative of like the level of value that you want to put out there. So yeah, I would say start weekly, and we have partners where we write newsletters 3 times a week for them, and those are more news and curation oriented. It's going to be harder to, if you're creating an update newsletter that is more reliant on aggregating news and kind of thoughtful curation, maybe more times a week is a good option. If you're writing short form original pieces or long form original pieces for that matter, that are more trying to provide like unique perspective into something, it's going to be harder to do that, 2 or 3 times a week. It might just be easier to do it once a week.
I wanted to run a little sampling exercise. I feel like you'd be a great candidate to ask this question. So among all the clients that you work with or other people with newsletters that you interacted with, how many of them started the newsletters with a business idea in mind or a product to sell in mind versus how many of them started with just a newsletter idea and figure what they want to sell later onwards? What's like the mix?
I would say 80%. I would say like 90 have a business idea and 10 or have a product or an existing way to monetize, and 10% don't. And I think what we found is we probably, and this goes back to your question around qualifying, it's just generally better to work with folks that have a product or a business idea, because it becomes a challenge for our service to mean anything, or for us to like exist or justify what we're doing. It should back into revenue at some point. And it's, building an audience is valuable, and like building an email list, you are building an asset for sure. But also, monetizing that list early on is a good decision for a lot of reasons. First, because you get paid back and you can invest more into the growth funnel. Second, you're kind of conditioning the people that are on that list to understand that, hey, it's a free newsletter, but I'm still going to sell stuff to you in it, right? Which is important in itself, because then what we've seen is if you launch a product after it's been a free newsletter for a while, people will react worse than if you just got a product in front of them earlier on. So kind of an interesting takeaway there. But yeah, so I'd say like a 90-10 split, but we'd like to keep it that way or even increase the proportion to folks that, have a product or a service that they're selling.
Makes sense. And especially with the service agency, I think having the dollar amount that you were able to convert or generate, it helps you to justify the amount that you're charging, because it's more direct. If you say I'm gonna charge you, I don't know, $5 a month for 20K subscribers that I brought in, then it would feel a bit iffy about like, oh, are those worth it? Are those 20K subscribers worth it? Versus, oh, I was able to generate 25K.
Exactly. it becomes a question of attributable value, attributable revenue pretty quickly. And that's what businesses are built on. That's the end goal of every business, is generating revenue. So you need to be able to prove that out quickly.
Awesome. So now I wanted to jump into my favorite session, which is called Draw Your Income. So Ryan, when let's think about all the activities or all the things that you were doing with the podcast, with the service agency. What is your income streams and what are the proportions like?
Yeah, so I would say we have Tailwind, which I think of as just like the newsletter as a service, us creating content. I have advisory work that I do for newsletters and media companies where it's just kind of one-on-one consulting. We have growth work that's like legacy stuff from prior to Tailwind, and we still have partners that we work with on that basis just because we've been working with them for a long time. And then the podcast, which is very little revenue right now because we're still in the process of generating sponsors that way. We did just actually have our first sponsor on a recent episode that we recorded. But so I'll leave the podcast out because it's not really relevant. But I would say it's probably 75% Tailwind, 20, like it's like percent Tailwind, 20% growth, and 10 by advisory is, I would say, kind of like the overall breakout of it all.
I see. So for growth, what is growth?
Yeah, growth being us managing growth channels for newsletters. So like us just agency services in which our team is managing Facebook campaigns, Twitter ad campaigns to help grow lists for companies that we work with.
And seeing how far newsletters have come to, it's fabulous as well. Back then when Morning Brew started, I think it was 2016 or so, to now when like millions of people, thousands of people are starting their own newsletters, and there are platforms like Beehive, just like super seamless, super integrated. And sponsors are also much more willing to sponsor newsletters as a distribution platform than back then. Like creators have to push themselves. I'm not a scammer. Please sponsor me so I can keep doing what I love for a living, right? So I am curious to think about the whole idea of newsletter. Do you think, are we in a hype cycle? Are we in a bubble? What do you think?
In terms of a bubble, I don't think it's a bubble. I think it is a hype cycle. What's happening is that a lot of people have seen big acquisitions like TheHustle, like Hubspot, or like a Morning Brew, I should say. They've seen these big acquisitions happen, and quite a few other newsletters, like Milk Road, for example, as well as another good example. And they think that, okay, so all I have to do is build a list to a certain number, and then once I hit 100,000 subscribers, sponsors will start coming my way, and or once I, let's say a lower number, because I think expectations are a little higher, even where it's like I'll hit 20 subscribers, sponsors will start knocking on my door, and I'll start making a lot of money, and I can sell for millions of dollars. I think that people that maybe went into it in that with those expectations in mind might be in for a rude awakening, especially if they haven't found other ways to monetize. A newsletter is ultimately just a medium for engaging an email list, right? Email lists are always going to be valuable because they're an owned audience, and building an owned audience is always going to be a good idea. So building a newsletter, or building an email list, I should say, is a good idea. And I don't think it's hard to have like an email list bubble. But that being said, I think a lot of people are overlooking the fact that the newsletter, again, kind of harkening back to what you were saying, it's a funnel, and the newsletter is really more like the top of funnel, or maybe the top middle of funnel in an ideal situation. People think of the newsletter as the bottom of the funnel. It's like, great, they're on my list. That's it. Like that's another subscriber. I'll be able to monetize any day now. It's like, no, you should really have a route to monetization on day one. And the newsletter acts as the top middle of funnel to driving to that monetization action. And so there's maybe a bubble of folks that aren't monetizing correctly, and that will burst. But if you have an idea that if you have a product or a service, and your idea is, hey, I'm going to build a newsletter which the function of that newsletter ultimately, outside of providing value, is driving to that business outcome, then, and you can do that effectively and not piss people off by being too salesy, then I think you'll be fine. That's a sustainable business.
I'm really curious about the idea of investment in newsletters. So we have gone through a phase where like it was beginning of BuzzFeed where it really kicked off and everyone would look at these media outlets and be like, oh, this is like such a great investment, and all these like VCs would like pour money into these like consumer internet or like consumer media businesses. And then it took a couple of years to realize, okay, like they weren't like super, super great business models, and oftentimes people lose a lot of money from it. And then until like 20-ish, where like these consumer media businesses weren't really getting any funding. And now I think it has become more popular concept now again, where like people would be more receptive to investing into newsletters, investing into media platforms. How do you think about, have you seen any like newsletters wanting to get funding, have raised money? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, Matthew Berry's Fantasy Life, a fantasy football newsletter. They raised a bunch of money, over $1 million, maybe a couple million. They're like a more multifaceted media outlet. The newsletter is the largest asset or the largest channel, but they have a YouTube channel, they have podcasts, they've got a lot of like kind of like fantasy influencers on their staff that all have large social followings. So, I mean, kind of a different, and they have a lot of sponsorship revenue too. So a different situation where it's already kind of established. The investment makes sense if if you've proven out the LTV of a subscriber and you think that could scale with more growth. That's ultimately what it all comes down to, is just like the lifetime value of a subscriber, how much money you're going to make on that subscriber over their lifetime on the list. In the case of a newsletter, or the lifetime that they're consuming your content for any other creator. And if there's like a good CAC to LTV ratio, so customer acquisition cost, how much it costs to get that person on your list, if the lifetime value is a lot higher than that, then you're doing great, right? You can afford to invest more. So if you can afford to invest more and scale growth while maintaining that acquisition cost to lifetime value ratio, then yeah, it's always going to make sense to invest in growth, but it doesn't always scale linearly. But yeah, it would be a bad decision to, again, just like in the name of building an audience, invest a bunch of money and just like building a list with no outcome in mind or no outcome proven. That's just my thinking. There could be people who would disagree with that and say, no, like if you build an audience to scale, then you can monetize that. That's riskier, of course, but it could potentially work. I would think more conservatively than that.
I like how you really drove everything back to the concept of LTV, because that is sort of the single most important thing for newsletters. And I think you also highlighted that there is a non-linear sort of trajectory for any sort of newsletters. Sometimes it might, for paid ads growth, it could be a little bit more linear, but for organic, it would always be non-linear. And if you look back in the big picture, it's like always non-linear in nature. So appreciate that.
Yeah, and even with paid specifically is kind of how I'm thinking about it, where it's if you're spending $100 a day on Facebook to acquire newsletter subscribers, you might be able to get them as affordably as 75 cents. And say your lifetime value is like $2, which would be really low. But like say you're just getting started, it's $2 and it's 75 cents to acquire. So you're profitable in how you're acquiring subscribers. If you spend $5 a day on a platform like Meta Ads, just by nature of how those platforms work and scaling budget on those platforms, your acquisition cost per subscriber is going to go way up. So like where you were acquiring subscribers for 75 cents, now you might be acquiring them for $4. So even if you're acquiring subscribers profitably at like a low budget, once you scale that budget, it might be a different story. So that's what I meant by non-linear. It's not always a function of just adding more money or more investment.
And now I wanted to tie back to, at the very beginning, we talked a little bit about TikTok. The White House just passed a ban on TikTok. It might get sold. It might get shut down. At your position, let's say if someone from TikTok or some creator from TikTok were asking you for advice, I'm building on this niche with like followings. I'm trying to diversify. I'm trying to build a newsletter. I have no experience in newsletter. What are the different steps that you would like instruct or tell him or her to do so?
I would add a link to the newsletter in your social to start. And then I would start maybe once a week in your content, start calling out the fact that you have a newsletter. TikTok's a hard one though, just because even running ads on TikTok, because it's the nature of it is short form video, there isn't like a direct one-to-one in interest in emails and like text-based format. You know, like Twitter is a lot easier. And that's why a lot of Twitter creators have more success building a newsletter, is because it's a text format. The audience there is generally more condensed, professional, and like you can build kind of your reach is oftentimes already kind of within your niche or your vertical or wherever you're building. Whereas TikTok it's a discovery platform. A lot of folks will just find your content through a video going viral or something like that. And there's less of a one-to-one interest in short form video to newsletters. So it might be harder to start with. But if I was to advise somebody to do this, I would say put a link in your social. I don't even know if you can put a link in the Twitter bio, or can you? So yeah, you can link out to a Twitter bio, link out to your newsletter in your Twitter bio, and then just start doing call to action. It's the same approach that you would take to Twitter, but just apply that to TikTok, where it's just trying to drive that traffic to your newsletter. And then you could also maybe like promote. You could try like promoting from your account too, just ads that are direct for your newsletter where there's a link there too. Like we've seen some success in TikTok acquisition. So like actually running paid TikTok ads to newsletters, you can get a decent cost per acquisition. It's just, and this goes back to kind of my point earlier, the engagement on those is going to be like really low, or lower than it would be on something like Twitter or Facebook. But yeah, so link out to it in your bio, call to actions to drive to the newsletter, maybe try running like small amounts of paid from your account, because people will recognize your account and it'll look more native.
Awesome. And lastly, I wanted to talk a little bit about the future of Tailwind, the future of what you want to do. I'm curious if you imagine like 3 to 5 years down the road, everything has went as expected. What would that look like?
Yeah, we would have greatly expanded our operations, and we would be serving a lot more companies and brands. We talked about ICP earlier and like defining that. That's something that we've transparently very recently started to define better for ourselves. And so my goal now is just moving and scaling more in that direction from a Tailwind perspective. I just think it would be great if we could build just a proven and reliable system for creators, for companies building information products, for agencies to generate leads and convert those leads through just valuable content. So that's the focus right now. And that's where we're experimenting and testing in and scaling in. And yeah, if all goes to plan, we'll just be doing a lot more of that.
Do you ever see yourself being in front of the screen, being on TikTok or Instagram or YouTube?
Yeah, I'm experimenting a lot more with short form video. And then my goal for this upcoming quarter is to commit to YouTube and like actually starting building YouTube. Because I do think just like video in general is a great skill, and being comfortable, getting in front of the screen and scripting and learning video editing and all of that, I think it's super valuable. And when you look at every platform, every social platform, it's the way everything's going. Like LinkedIn just launched short form video, a discovery platform for short form video. So, and Twitter's algorithm now favors video even over like long form posts and all that. So anybody who gets good at video is gonna be able to build at least a big rented audience, and then you translate it to an owned audience, and all's good. So yeah.
Awesome. Is there like an angle for you or like a milestone that you want to hit?
I think I'm not building for an exit, but I'm not building with an exit in mind for something like Tailwind, but I'm definitely building systems so that would be possible. I think if, I'm thinking in somewhat longer time horizons, but I would say, it's hard to say. I do have numbers in mind for all this stuff, but right now it's just about building the systems and making sure that we're doing the right thing day in, day out. That's my focus more than a long-term goal at the moment.
Awesome. And that wraps up for the episode. And again, it's a huge pleasure to have you onto the show. And thank you so much for sharing all your insights and experiences.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for having me on. It was a lot of fun.
So that is it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. All the links and resources will be shared in the descriptions. And if you'd like to support the podcast, please leave us a 5-star rating on whichever platform that you're on. It would help us a ton to reach new audiences. Thank you so much for listening. And again, I see you in the next one.